Thank you all for joining us here today for our interactive discussion on Eleanor Roosevelt, Legacies and Leadership. I'd like to begin by introducing our panel. We'll begin with Marie Demore here in the center. She's been the Deputy Chief of Mission here at the U.S. Embassy in Wellington since August 2011. She's a career member of the Foreign Service since January 1993. I'm sorry to give the dates.
Okay.
And has served overseas in Brazil as Country Consular Coordinator, in London as Chief of Visa Services, in Baghdad, Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam, Paris, and is it Nouakchott, Mauritania? Nouakchott, Mauritania. I have never been there. While in Washington, D.C., she had the opportunity to serve as Special Assistant to then Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. Next on our panel at the end here is Gillian Peacock. She's the HR Director at Dispute Resolution Services and also the Chairperson of Volunteering New Zealand. She's a board member of Social Development Partners and a founding member of Women in Leadership Aotearoa, which for those of us who are not from New Zealand is actually the Maori name for New Zealand. Gillian is also serving on the Ministry of Women's Affairs Leadership Advisory Group. Of note in her background, she actually designed the Rugby World Cup 2011 volunteer program here in New Zealand, and was the National People and Capability Manager at New Zealand Red Cross at the time of the Christchurch earthquakes in 2011 as well. It's been a busy year for you. She notes here that developing capability and capacity in organizations, and specifically for women, is her passion. And next to me here is Vanessa Diru. She's the Chief Executive of Volunteering New Zealand. Previously, she worked as the fundraising manager for the New Zealand Red Cross, which is a nice linkage again to Eleanor Roosevelt. And she was Corporate Responsibility Advisor for ANZ Bank. She sees and helps create real opportunities in developing the intersection between charitable work and government and corporate outreach in New Zealand. She is on the board of the National Council of Women New Zealand, on the leadership team of Women in Leadership Aotearoa, and she is chair and trustee of Inspiring Stories Trust and happens to also be a Justice of the Peace, should we need one before the end of the event. So let me begin today. First of all, thank you, ladies, for joining us, and thank you to those of you in the audience here and coming in from remote locations. On August 28, 1943, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt wrote in her My Day column, which you can view on the Embassy's blog if you'd like, she wrote from New Zealand the following statement, and I quote, "This is a period when women are doing new things in many places, sometimes from sheer necessity, sometimes because they have long wanted to do something different, but conventionalities have held them back. Now the world is a freer world, and those with capacity, whether men or women, are in demand." And so the question I'd like to begin with today is, how is a statement such as this, dating back from 1943, resonant with your concept of women as leaders now in 2013? Is it true that women with this capacity are truly in demand, and how are they taking advantage of that? Would you let you decide who gets to start?
Everybody's looking at me. Really interesting statement, and I'm reflecting on that and thinking about my own mother's experience back during the war years, and I can distinctly remember her telling me that women stepped up only to step back when men arrived home from war. And I think that this is again reflected in today, that we have women who are still trying to break through that leadership ceiling, or to not, as they say, leak out of the leadership pipeline. And we're still battling that, and I don't think the pendulum has actually swung far enough yet. And we don't have enough women leaders in enough organisations or enough corporates or not-for-profits across the whole of New Zealand and probably globally.
No, I would agree with that statement. I also think the statement that Eleanor made 70 years ago does ring true today, that there is a great recognition of the need for diversity in the workplace and the need for diversity in the NGO space. And I think the smarter organizations, whether they be private sector or government or the nonprofit sector, I think they're recognizing that diversity, whether it be in gender or ethnic background or educational experience, that makes institutions stronger. And so the smarter, more nimble organizations really are focusing on trying to cultivate their best leaders, whether or not those are women or men. On the other hand, there is still a great deal of distance to go, particularly in certain economic sectors where women are massively underrepresented.
I'd agree as well with capacity being something that is something that's really true to leadership, but I guess my concept of leadership goes right throughout different roles in our lives, and I think women today, and particularly women in the home that are leaders, there's a greater capacity need for people to be all-rounders and being able to do everything that's needed in their home life, and that includes how they give back to the community as well as how they work within their role or their job, if they are involved in paid work, as well as being someone that is potentially a leader for their children as well. And I think totally agree that capacity is truly important for women today.
Can I add a comment there that whole picture that you just painted, Vanessa, about women juggling everything to be a leader across every aspect of their lives is one of the things that probably holds women leaders back, because they, unlike men who can focus on a career, women are also focusing on family, and that might be children and parents. They're focusing on community, they're focusing on many, many aspects as well as their career, and that makes it just more difficult for them to have the visibility as leaders in more visible roles.
And women tend to take more criticism if they are perceived to be neglecting the family role or the community role, whereas men generally don't receive that criticism. On the other hand, it can go the other way. I have a great recollection of a neighbor when I was living in Washington who the wife worked in a really nice job outside the home, and he stayed home with their 2 little girls, and he took a lot of, flack from the other men in the neighborhood for taking on that non-traditional role. And this was in 1997. It's not like it was back in the Dark Ages. So I think it runs true across, but that the juggling role is one I think women are far more cognizant of in a lot of ways, and for a lot of reasons.
Vanessa, can I follow up on that theme that you're discussing? Because the issue of work-life balance focuses very much on some of those aspects you've touched on, which is having a job and raising children. But you're very involved in volunteerism, and I'd be very interested to know how you've seen the nature of volunteerism by women change as they grapple with these competing demands in the work-life balance.
A lot of the volunteering that happens in New Zealand is around our families and communities, and particularly in school with children that are involved right across the community. So I guess what we're seeing is greater demand for mothers and people that are looking after children that are women to be on committees, do fundraising, organise events, and all of that work that they are doing for free as an unpaid as a volunteer is impacting on the type of volunteer work that they will actually look at. So what we're seeing in volunteering across New Zealand is that more people are doing episodic volunteering, so they're doing short, sharp bursts of work, and so women are focusing in on particular events and then getting a little bit burnt out perhaps, and then coming out and then coming back and focusing on their family and their career, and then going back in to do another piece of volunteer work. So that kind of pattern is going throughout volunteering across the world. But I think women in particular really want to give things a good shot and do the best that they can and offer as much time as they possibly can give. And that passion that comes out of doing volunteer work it has to balance up with how much time they realistically have. And what we're seeing is that there is an increase in hours given by the number of volunteers in New Zealand, but we haven't got a growth in the number of people actually volunteering. So that kind of rings true for, I would suspect, the women in New Zealand.
Okay. To move to sort of a different topic, Marie, one question that's been asked is how can women leaders in particular, but also governments, help improve or solve gender-specific or related issues, such as domestic or gender-based violence or pay equity? I know in New Zealand there's a Ministry of Women's Affairs. We don't have something comparable.
No, but I think there's absolutely a role for government in it, and the first thing they have to do is lead by example. I mean, one of the big things that helped with women's equality in the United States was when the U.S. government said very succinctly that the general's pay scale would apply regardless of whether it was men or women. So, it's very clear everybody at the same level of job is getting the same amount of pay regardless of gender. The other thing that women leaders can do and governments can do, it doesn't have to be restricted to women, is to raise these issues in high-level fora. The State Department created an Office of Global Women's Issues, and it was a very important office, particularly under former Secretary Clinton, who, even as First Lady, when she went to the Global Women's Forum in Beijing, stated quite succinctly, women's rights are human rights. And just that very short, almost soundbite, raised the question of women's rights in the world to a global level. And then when she was Secretary of State, she came to the Pacific Islands Forum last year in the Cook Islands. And, it's just by being there, it makes a statement. She was the only female leader at that table. Women leaders set the example. Governments set the example. And particularly Secretary Clinton, but also Secretary Kerry now, talks about women's issues not as, quote, women's issues, but issues of family, issues of economics, issues of development, because there is, research has demonstrated there's a very strong tie between women's development and the development level of the country. That there's a causal relationship there, and it is, the really truly blind or unknowing governments who ignore those kinds of indicators and those kinds of information. So simply by setting the example and picking important, in some ways symbolic but very real issues. For example, the State Department created something called Tech Girls as a way to bring together girls from 8 Middle Eastern countries to get more involved and meet each other and meet mentors in science, technology, engineering, and maths, areas where women are traditionally underrepresented and massively underrepresented in those countries. So by raising these issues to a high level, by having the mentorship relationships, women leaders and government leaders can combine to improve the situation, not just locally, but globally.
Thank you. Jillian, we'll move down to you for a moment. So you noted in your biography, as I read, that you are working to increase capacity and capability in organizations, especially for women. I think I'd be interested in some examples of steps that companies can take to ensure the best use of their talent, both regardless of gender, but specific to women as well, through all levels of the organization.
Sure. I think in relation to what Marie was saying, that the thing that we struggle with most is unconscious bias. And that's where, we think that we are flexible and we think that we are open to women being in those leadership roles, but actually a lot of the time we're not. And setting the example is one of the ways to do that, but there are other barriers and challenges that we need to address. In my own organisation, I've been fortunate to work with a CEO who was very clear that he wanted a diverse senior management team and more diversity, in the layers in the organisation. And we have a team that's diverse in age, from 39 to 63. We have 3 women on a senior management team out of 6, and we have ethnicity diversity as well. So that's been a real a tick in the box for me. I feel quite proud of having achieved that because I've been involved in hiring those people. I think too that some of the things that we can do, and from a government point of view, that we can advocate for is changes to things like how women are paid and getting that balance right, making sure we have parity. But also there are things technically that we can do around payroll. If women want to work part-time and work flexible hours, then the way we manage payroll and the whole issue around Mondayisation, which means that, if you work a 4-day week and you choose to have Monday off, and every time we have a statutory holiday and it falls on a Monday, you don't get paid for that. You lose out on that. If you do work on that Monday, that affects your part-time hours. There's a whole lot of stuff in behind there around accrual of annual leave and sick leave that are affected by those small, what seem, not terribly important, but those technical things that disadvantage women because they see how it erodes what they actually earn, which may be, mostly going towards childcare. So there are lots of things there that we could do to change and tweak just small things that are actually legislative through government to make it easier for women to participate at a leadership level in organisations.
And I think it's important to take from that as well that many of those changes that are coming as a result of perhaps Gen Y workplace demands or part-time work demands do also benefit the men in the workplace as well. I think that sometimes gets lost in the debate, that a flexible work time would go both ways.
Yeah. The other big issue there too is the way we recruit and what we think are the right kinds of traits and competencies, and male leaders we look at them and we think, okay, we want to see great decision making, we want to see these kinds of traits, and for women we often think, oh, a woman leader, she's kind and she's gentle, and unless a woman behaves in the same way as a man, then she doesn't actually make it into those roles. And again, that's that unconscious bias. But then when she makes it into those roles and she behaves the same way as a man, what do we say? Often she's derided for that behaviour. So it's a really fine balance for us, I think.
I'd be interested just to pick up around the flexibility of time. And as a leader, I've recently been working with a new mentor of mine who's a male, and we've been thinking about the time or the use of my time during the day and what days or what times of the day I'm productive, and how we can play to that strength and the flexibility of jobs and workplaces. So potentially people are working on days and at times of the day when they're the most productive, and how that can counterbalance. And I suspect for some people, or particularly women that are busy running households and families and children and all those other commitments that they have, particular times of the day might actually be more productive and better use of their time. So instead of doing your normal 40-hour day a week from 9 to 5, it's more flexible, but based on where it is that you might be able to give the most time and the most use of your brain.
You've given me some food for thought to go to my boss and talk about flexible work hours. But you touched on something actually that is another really popular topic right now, which is the concept of mentorship, either giving or receiving. To start off with, I'd like to ask the three of you ladies, how do you find yourself mentoring? Do you find yourself mentoring? Do you seek out people in a particular gender? Do you look at people who you think have particular traits? I mean, how have you thought about it, and if so, how do you implement it?
Yes, I have thought about it, and I use, I think, a combination of coaching and mentoring, and they are two different things. And I think for mentoring, for me, I often look at young women, and I think about how I can help open a door, and or what kind of advice or my skills that I can give them to help them advance. And that often comes down to things like, for my daughters, and who are 24, I've got twin girls, and their friends, that's been around giving them advice on how to apply for a job, how to get their CVs organised, who they could talk to, how to market themselves, how to actually be interviewed and to come across well in an interview, answer the questions correctly. So I do a lot of that, as well as actually, making sure they're networking with the right people to give them the opportunities. So I think focusing on the younger generation is really important.
State Department actually has a formal mentoring process, which is quite nice, and then there's a informal process. For example, I have an officer who, when she joined the State Department, I became her mentor. She's doing just fine, so we usually only speak about once a year, but she knows I'm there. She has a specific question. But in my job here at the embassy in Wellington, I'm as the Deputy Chief of Mission, I have formal responsibility to be a mentor, not a coach, a mentor to what we call the entry-level officers, the officers who are on their first or second tour in the State Department. And so I make a point of once a month having a discussion with them about any topic they choose to bring up about life in the Foreign Service or life as a diplomat, furthering their careers, sometimes very nuts and bolts issues. That's irrespective of their gender. All right, it's, and irrespective of their life experience, I have that formal responsibility. However, because when I entered, I had some very, very strong female role models in the State Department, I have been very conscious of my obligation to pass on sort of that, with the wisdom and the experience that came down to me from those women who were just fabulous mentors to me in my career. So I've made a special effort with some folks that I think genuinely will add to the institution, or who maybe need to be gently directed in another way, because in my opinion, while they won't necessarily make great diplomats, they would make great something else. And that is an obligation that I also have to the institution. When we have to think about that, we not only have obligations as leaders to the people who work for us, but we have an obligation to the future of the institution that we are helping to lead. And sometimes that means you explain to somebody they are best suited for some other career or role in life.
The obligation to mentor, I always have a feeling, growing up in New Zealand as a New Zealand-born Indian, I never saw any role models of Indian women coming through the ranks, and I feel quite a great obligation to be able to do that for young female Indians in New Zealand. So always working in the space of ethnic diversity and young leadership there. In terms of my own mentoring, I mentioned before, I'm constantly changing different people that I work with in terms of my own mentoring. And I have sometimes I work with women, sometimes I work with men, but some of the strongest mentoring has come through peer mentor groups, and particularly women's mentoring groups, and whether they're formal or informal, and some of the strongest informal ones I have with other CEOs in the not-for-profit sector currently that are leaders and are women, that are there to help inspire, rejuvenate my energy to work in the space of the not-for-profit sector, and it never doubts me that that is so valuable, and just as equally as important as my one-on-one mentoring with a male mentor.
No, thank you. We'll move toward the slightly more political or theoretical, as it were. So this month, New Zealand is celebrating the 120th anniversary of granting women the vote. In that time, New Zealand recently has had 2 female prime ministers and a female governor general and a female head of the Supreme Court. But looking around, and I believe I will have somebody quote the statistic to me, but women make up less than 5% of board positions. There's a real gap. In the United States, there's a feeling that somebody like Hillary Clinton has done a phenomenal job as Secretary of State. There is sometimes the argument that there is very little left to be done. But we all know that not to be the case. I had the opportunity yesterday to interview the Minister of Women's Affairs, and we discussed how much farther we have to go in shining the light on those corners that still remain, or dealing with the unconscious bias, or, for example, the fact that women are less likely to negotiate initial salaries. So my question to you is, how do you address that gap? Are quotas a reasonable answer? What techniques or tips would you recommend? Oh, it's a tough one.
It is a tough
Quotas?
I'll put it out there. I'm personally not a big fan of quotas. I believe it's the right person for the right job at the right time. What I think we need to really focus on is making sure we've got enough women in the pool that are ready and rocking to go into those roles that potentially might be on boards, or they might be in senior management teams. But I don't think necessarily always, and this goes back to my concept of what leadership is, that we need to really always only focus at the board level for women in leadership. Yes, that's very important, but we need to make sure that we've got great women right through our organisations, right through our communities, because leadership happens at lots of different levels. And I guess it then just depends on what your concept of what a great leader is. And so quotas, yep, go for it if you need to. It's a good marker, good way to get some goals, good way to do some measurement, but still think it's the best person for the job that should be in the boardroom.
Yeah, I don't feel deeply qualified to expound on the issue of quotas, though I think it probably is, with many things, depends on the environment and the culture and the country that you're working in. In my year in Baghdad, they had the first elections that they'd held. And there was a quota for every party to have at least 1/3 of their members. It was all list. So at least 1/3 of their members of parliament, based on their allocation, had to be women. And it was really fascinating to see the diversity of the women who were selected by the different parties. And it seemed to work for them as they were still trying to determine how they wanted their democratic system to process. You know, this was the first truly free election they'd had, probably ever. So again, I would agree, though, in general, what you always want is the best person for the job. But then where do you start? You know, how do you start to shine the light? You know, there are a lot of studies about the issues of should we have same gender classrooms because of bias one way or the other in how girls and boys are treated, even in grade schools. How do you ensure that you don't have these unconscious or even semi-conscious bias at university level where women get steered into, women's areas like, English literature as opposed to IT fields? So from my standpoint, I don't think there can be a prescription for what is going to work better in one environment than another. The trouble is, maybe we as women leaders need to ensure we're focusing on those areas that we feel most passionately about, because that's what's likely to move the goal forward.
I think that, interestingly, I would actually say let's do quotas. And as much as I think it should be on merit, I don't think we affect real change unless we put some hard and fast, lines in the sand. And to demonstrate that, I guess I was getting off a plane in Auckland a few weeks ago, and I was heading to a meeting run by the Ministry of Women's Affairs about the leaking leadership pipeline, and that's about women leaders not being, falling out of the system. And I bumped into a friend on the plane, and he said to me, "What are you doing?" And I told him, and he said, "Haven't we sorted that?" And I said to him, "How many women on your board, Dan?" 1 out of a board of 8. Mm-hmm. And I just looked at, the thought, the dawning realisation on his face as I looked at him. But, that won't change in those sorts of organisations until we start pushing harder for more women and for at least half women on each board. And there's been a lot of great research that shows that your decision making gets better when you have diversity round the table, and we need to start making that happen, and we need to be stronger about it, I think.
Yeah. No? Oh, sorry, I thought you were going to continue. So here's one, sort of a general question, which is, what has been the biggest challenge for you in achieving your career goals? And I don't think this is a gender-specific, you personally, as a person.
I was lucky enough to be placed on a leadership course when I was in my first role straight out of university, and I was pushed together with 60 young people from across the country over 18 months to talk about life, leadership and love, probably. I guess the bit that has been the hardest is really understanding what it is that I think I can contribute to the world. Once I got over that hurdle, I was able to articulate that really easily, and then the hardest bit for me was to share that across everyone I knew, and to make me get to the place where I am today, which is exactly what I wanted to do 8 years ago. So I had an 8-year plan of working in a leadership role for the not-for-profit sector. 8 years later, I landed there before I was 30 as a CEO for Volunteering New Zealand. But to get there, the hardest bit was to tell everyone that that's what I wanted to do. And when you're 27, 28, telling people that you want to be the CEO of a not-for-profit, and you're working in the communications and sponsorship industry in a corporate sector, they all kind of look at you and go, why? What for? Why do you want to be CEO? And, you know, is that another Gen Y thing? But actually, the more that I shared that with people, the easier it got. And that is why many people opened the door for me and allowed me to get to this position now that I'm in. And now I feel like I'm at that next stage where I'm ready to share the next vision for my career and life, but I'm still trying to articulate that.
Okay, so no big announcement.
So yeah, no, sorry. I won't share that today.
I was looking for something exciting today.
But it's very hard. It's very hard to share your deepest passion and thought because it rings so true, especially if you are so committed to wanting to do it. Sometimes it can be so hard to share it and raise it or, you know, yell it out across the rooftops to ensure that you get that buy-in from people around you.
I'm feeling very much like an underachiever right now, so I have to tell you. Because I was 27, 28 before I figured out what I wanted to do. And quite literally. And I think for me that's been the biggest challenge in my career, is actually deciding what my goal in my career was. When I joined the State Department at 27, 28, I really didn't have a goal beyond having a very interesting professional life and getting thrown out kicking and screaming at 65 when the mandatory retirement age kicked in. And it was a good 10 years into my career before I finally identified and said, aha, this is what I want to achieve. So for me, it wasn't running up against institutional barriers or having trouble identifying opportunities. It was actually identifying what that goal was. And in many ways, the State Department has been a perfect career for me because my interests were so varied and my interests were so wide that it was hard to focus down. Because in this career, you know, I've served on every continent on the planet at this point. I've done such a wide variety of things representing the U.S. overseas. We are a large and complicated country, so you have to know a little bit about a lot of things. So I truly envy people who have a very clear vision of what they want to do in life, because that was never me.
I never had a clear vision on what NGO I wanted to work for.
Oh, okay.
So I was very lucky when the role at Volunteering New Zealand came up, and it was such a wide and broad base. I thought, okay, this is where I will start.
Yeah. And that's a gift when you have those realizations.
So Gillian, where do you fall on the still figuring it out or new from birth?
Still growing up. And interestingly, I think probably somewhere in the middle of that, being a bit older perhaps, I didn't even know that those opportunities were open to me growing up. I grew up and didn't know, and probably because of the socioeconomic group that I grew up in, I didn't know that I could go to university. And I didn't do that until my children were 2. And so there's some things in there, but I agree totally with Vanessa. It's about belief in yourself and about confidence. To be able to articulate who you are and what you are good at and that you are a leader. And those are things that are becoming clearer to me over the last, probably only over the last 5 years. And, some of us do take a long time to mature. And to be recognised. And I think something that happens for women is around, there's a great example about writing your CVs and then applying for roles. Women will look at a job advertisement and at a position description and they'll go, I could apply for that, but only if I could do about 90% of what's on that position description. A man will look at that advertisement and that job description and he'll say, 50% nailed, I'll go for it. And there's a real difference in how we perceive our own abilities and capabilities. Yeah.
I don't know, are there any questions from the audience before? I keep controlling them. Would you like to please go?
So I think we've touched on it a bit already in the panel discussion, and thank you all very much for speaking. There's this persistent pay gap in New Zealand, in many countries around the world. And, we keep seeing stories that bring it to light, whether it's aged care workers who have been specialised in that for 20 years, still on minimum wage. Then right up at the other end, you've got women in leadership positions are in a higher proportion of charity, non-profit leadership roles, and yet those roles pay less. So the common thread between those kind of jobs is a highly specialised skill of empathy and compassion. That's not something that can be taught. That's a really innate skill. And stereotypically you might say it's a female skill, but, it's not for granted. But I guess my question is, how can we get the labour market the price of the salary market to put a higher dollar value on those skills of empathy and compassion?
That's a brilliant question. I wish I had an answer for it. And I think part of it is we have to start demanding it. We have a responsibility. We are part of the system, and we have a responsibility to speak up and say this deserves to be more valued in the workplace. And that goes across a lot of things. I mean, I have my own issues personally with the fact that in U.S. universities, the football coach is paid better than the president of the university, and certainly paid better than any of the, Nobel Prize researchers. It's what do we as societies value? What do we put a value on? Because salaries tend to go with that, the question is, what are you willing to do to make it happen? There are some things we're just not willing to do. We're not willing to strike and not feed our children. We're not willing to strike and not take care of the elderly in care homes. On the other hand, I think there's a great deal to be done in terms of educating people, both women to ensure that they're demanding the salaries, and men to understand that this has a value for them as well. It's not man versus woman in that area, but that the salaries for all caregivers should be raised commensurate with the value we should be putting on those jobs.
Again, it comes down to the confidence to value yourself. And, just that point I was making before about men will put themselves forward and they'll ask for those things, where women hold back thinking that they don't actually have those enough to offer to be paid at a higher rate. I think some of the things we can do, I mentioned before, is changing legislation and advocating for that. And the other thing is that if you're in a position in your own organisation where you can make a difference at that level, then you should do it. And I've just finished the remuneration review for the organisation I work for, and one of the things that I've worked on and our CEO has asked for is for me to ensure that there is pay parity between males and females holding similar roles. And we've done quite a bit of work around that. Yeah.
I think also just highlighting those issues and bringing up some good case studies doesn't go amiss in trying to change people's behaviour and how people can start thinking about pay parity. But I'm a real believer that New Zealand women particularly are not great at asking for potentially more salaries, and we all know that once you get into an organisation and you start a role, it's very hard to move up exponentially unless you've got a direct career path and people have opened the doors for you. So moving within organisation or between organisations and having that, when you've got those opportunities, to try and make sure that you get a further increase or reposition yourself in terms of the labour market, that you take that opportunity and you go for it. And you go all guns blazing.
They can only say no.
They can only say no, and then you can either just say no yourself or, knock it down a little bit and then ask again.
Lauren?
I have a question. We've already talked about unconscious bias a little bit. I've been very lucky to spend the last few days with our visiting speaker from the US, who is the former diversity manager for Oracle. And she's got founded this organisation called Gender Allies, which is about men and women working in partnership to achieve equality equality in the workplace. And I've been hearing a lot about unconscious bias and career path, and how you can't be what you can't see. And you don't see a lot of women in construction advertising. You don't see the language around job adverts for traditionally male roles, like forestry and the transport industry. Do you have any ideas about how we can open doors for women and young girls in the way that they can see a place for themselves in those industries? And also the science, technology, engineering and mathematics. There's a big gap there.
I think probably through schools and universities, and we have to start young, I guess, in educating, raising awareness that those opportunities are there, and that you can, put your toe in the water and have a shot at something a bit different that we wouldn't have considered previously, I guess. And that may be our responsibility as well to, as Vanessa says, case studies are always great ways to do that. It's interesting. I was thinking about, Vanessa was the first question you answered, I think, Vanessa, when you talked about volunteering. I can remember when I worked at the fire service here in Wellington in New Zealand, and I was their first volunteer HR manager for the volunteer fire brigade. And we started looking at female firefighters, because they were the people that were available between 9 and 3, because the men were working. And, it's about targeting groups that you think will actually get something out of that, as well as giving the organisation what it needs. So it has to be a win-win, I guess. Yeah.
I liked your statement about targeting, because the State Department has had to do that. When we recruit for new officers, one of the ways we do that is sending what we call ambassadors in residence to universities in the United States, and to try to get a more diverse workforce. Instead of going to the traditional sort of Ivy League or East Coast foreign policy schools, they've been sending people to the University of Arizona or the University of Texas, or some of the traditionally black colleges in the United States, to make people aware of the career. Even when I joined, I still only had the vaguest idea of what the State Department did. So just making people aware that the career is out there. And then we also have to start a whole lot younger with some of these unconscious biases. Like, what are the toys in the store for girls that are geared towards girls? What is the advertising for girls? One of my favorite toys growing up was a Tonka dump truck. There was nothing inherently gender specific about that. Now, it didn't mean necessarily I wanted to go into construction. I like my job, thank you very much. But it did mean my parents had a much more flexible attitude about what was appropriate for their children. And I think that is also a key. We as a society have to be much more conscious about the way we are selling these things.
If I may, I actually went to a speech or a talk last week at Queen Margaret College on this topic, and they said that most children's preferences or possible career futures are chosen by the age of 14. So if you have turned a girl off of mathematics, and girls do disproportionately suffer from math anxiety, by 10 or 11 or 12 or 13, they're very unlikely to go into that type of career.
True.
I think very quickly we also need to ensure that our educational institutions have got really open courses and are doing the right marketing. So the construction industry courses are opening up their doors for women, and perhaps there's some ways to get some good scholarships in there. Or I just remember the surge in the number of teachers a few years ago, because they were giving a number of teaching scholarships away. The government was to increase the number of teachers going through our universities. Whether there can be something in the construction, engineering, any of those other workplace, those kind of trade areas. But also to help develop the career pathway, we need to probably talk to a few employers and make sure that they've got their doors open and are thinking about it as well. And I know many of them are, but it's making sure that we continue to encourage them to stay thinking about it and to continue doing their marketing in great ways to attract women.
And they have to think about the way they're dealing with their current workforces as well. The fact that in some of these traditionally male-dominated areas like law enforcement or firefighting or construction, how the women in those industries are treated when they do get the jobs is extraordinarily important. And there are some really tough women out there who soldier on. I think of, what it must have been like for the first woman at a U.S. military academy. The kinds of challenges they would have had to face and managed to surmount at probably great personal cost. So we have to make sure that we're not just talking to the industries, but they are talking to their workforces about, how to be respectful of everybody on the work site. That's not just something that's good for women, that's good for all of their employees.
Well, it's interesting. I'm sorry, did you have a question or you?
Oh, no.
Okay, just turning. One of the, you actually touched on construction is very topical, and I don't want to steal the thunder, but for those who follow this, the Ministry of Women's Affairs will be making an announcement in Christchurch at the end of next week around the effects of that earthquake in 2011, specifically on females in employment. There is a real chance there with the rebuild to direct more women into non-traditional careers, and that ministry is looking very much at how that will work. I know the Minister of Women's Affairs likes to mention a story about how women bring a very different characteristic, specifically in the type of risk profile that they're willing to tolerate on a work site, shutting things down if they feel unsafe in a way that perhaps the men on the team would not do. So, Gillian, I know you were very involved in the response to the 2011 earthquakes. Based on that experience, are there things that you think women as leaders or women in this reconstruction could bring that could be lessons learned for the future?
I think exactly what you've already said. They're much more, quick to call something in the case of risk. There isn't, in most cases, their egos don't get in the way of decision making, and they show a lot more compassion and kindness to the people that they're dealing with. I think they also have they bring a wealth of knowledge in managing people and getting the best out of people. And that's just one of the traits that we have that, some men also have, but I think that we're stronger in that area. And I think in the earthquake, the women, again, like during the war, bringing it back to the beginning of our discussion, the women step up and they take those lead roles because men are off busy doing something else. And that's when they really shine. And you do see them, become real leaders.
Well, and I think I know Maria's probably seen something similar in Baghdad after after what happened there. The differences in how women or men would approach basically the rebuilding of the country.
It was fascinating to watch, and it was also really fascinating to watch the women that worked for me in how they grew into the roles that they inhabited. One of my staff, who was responsible for how we were processing visas for members of the Iraqi government, I will never forget, this is a 27-year-old woman, never forget the look on her face. After about a 30-minute phone call, she was on the phone describing to somebody how to fill out their visa application. She got off and she said, "I just told the National Security Advisor to the President of Iraq what to do, and he did it." And she just couldn't believe that was her. And you could almost, in that instant, see her vision of her future absolutely transformed. And that her expectations of herself became so much greater than they had been. And it was moments like that you could see replicated when Nancy Pelosi, who was at the time the minority leader of the U.S. House of Representatives, brought a group of female legislators from the U.S. Congress, and we had a lunch with the women who had just been elected to the Iraqi parliament, and Nancy Pelosi explaining to them how to leverage their minority status to advance their legislative agenda, presuming they had one. And you could see them, again, envision what the possible. Now, was it probable is a different question. But if you don't even understand what's possible, how do you even hope to achieve it?
And sort of taking that across, Vanessa, you work, we've had some conversations in the past about New Zealand as a multicultural society and how that concept of volunteerism or how that concept of career path can differ from one particular ethnic group or one cultural background to another. You've touched on it as well as a New Zealand-born Indian. I don't know if you have any thoughts on the possibilities within that realm.
I think it's, we just need to keep working with whoever comes into this country, comes into our communities around all of the possibilities that are available. Something around, I was just thinking around labelling non-traditional careers. One day I'd just love for that not to be a label. Like, it just seems crazy that suddenly, we're doing all this work and effort around non-traditional careers for women. And, I hope that we one day will just make it'll be the careers, spanning right throughout any industry, any sector, and we don't have to be talking about anything that is non-traditional or, women work in no barriers, that it's just empty. But I think, that's where I see a lot of the multicultural organisations. I spoke with the Multicultural Council yesterday, and they just, they bring people into this country and they want to understand what opportunities are available, and it's so different in their own countries before coming or after coming here to understand some of the possibilities. And so we just need to be able to freely demonstrate what they are and give examples, because what you don't know.
Right.
Apparently we have a lot of light to shine. I'm just checking for the other. Yes,
I have one. Unfortunately, in my opinion, one of the greatest barriers to women progressing in their career is obviously having children and moving out to have children and then coming back. And your organisations all seem to be quite great at building up women leadership. How does your organisations deal with the issue of care and the perception of how that is provided? As a traditional female role, how do we deal with that to bring women back into the workforce or make them continue on?
I think, one of the things that's happened in New Zealand government, and there are a number of government departments and ministries around town in Wellington, I don't know how widespread this is across the country, who have creches. So there's been a bit of a move there. I don't think it's probably not gone far enough yet. And I think in private organisations that wouldn't be happening quite as well. In terms of, giving women that flexibility, and I think I talked about that before, flexibility to really still pick up their career and keep going from the place they left off and be able to balance looking after their children. And I think the thing that's happening more and more these days is at the other end, balancing looking after ageing parents as well. They're being squashed by both of those things, and it ends up being their responsibility and not, quite often not their partner's responsibility, male partner. Yeah, it's a really tricky one. I think it's about that legislation, what we can do to advocate in government to get changes, real changes, to make it easier for women.
Yeah, I would love to say the State Department has made it easy, but at least I will say one thing: the State Department is at least aware of the issue, and they are trying. And there are a couple of things that work in the State Department's favor. One is the wonderful invention of the phrase "leave without pay." The State Department, without really imposing too much of a career penalty, allows anyone to take a year off from the State Department. It is without pay, so hopefully you have another partner working or have a sufficient build-up, but it allows women a breath. We don't have paid maternity leave in the United States. So for a lot of women, the issue of will I lose, there's Dorothy sighing in the background, a lot of women fear they will lose the momentum in their careers if they take a lot of time with their kids. So that LWOP has been a wonderful invention. And the other thing, quite frankly, is the fact that we are the foreign service. And a lot of people, not just women, but a lot of people very deliberately spend most of their careers overseas and most of their careers in countries where live-in home care is much cheaper than it is in the United States. But the fact of the matter is, state has had to focus on this issue because in order to maintain the diversity of their workforce, they have had to focus on the issue, create creches that we call diplotots. It's very cute. But the fact is, most Foreign Service officers leave the Foreign Service. They quit and take other jobs because of family issues. And women resign at far higher rates than men do. The State Department has done a great job of recruiting women into the Foreign Service, and there's some really fabulous women leaders in the Foreign Service, but we do get out more often because, you know, it's still hard to find a man who's willing to follow you around the world. Demands of aging parents, which is hard for any Foreign Service officer if you are literally on the other side of the planet from your parents who are getting elderly, and the complications that come with raising children and trying to do it in other countries where the education system or the medical system may not be what you want for your kids.
I think there's some opportunity to do some redesign of organisations in terms of how they deliver what needs to be done through the people and resources. So 21st century, we're in the technology age. How can we utilise technology in better ways to allow women to work from home more efficiently? I look at the volunteer management structures in New Zealand, New Zealand non-profits. So many of them are starting to look at digital technologies to engage volunteers, and so they've got flexible ways of volunteering. Can some of those new ideas that volunteer managers be implemented in paid workforces? There's got to be ways to get around this through technology. You know, especially in New Zealand, we're leading in these digital areas, so there's got to be some social enterprises and startups that have got to help with some of this redesign, because there needs to be some rethinking around this. So we don't need to be just doing the same 9 to 5 as we always have.
I heard a story the other day actually about some a couple of women in Ireland, I think it was, in the UK, who wanted to, or who had been put on a night shift for a technology company, and they were finding that much too difficult. And I think it was about the contact centre, and they were the specialist people doing this, you know, the help desk. So what did they do? They shipped them to New Zealand, where they work during the day, sleep at night, but during the day it is night time where they need to be answering those questions. So I thought that was really creative and innovative flexibility on the part of their employer to come up with that kind of solution. I think it works. You know, we can think remote access, all of those things. It's never going to work for somebody in retail. It's never going to work for someone in construction. We need to, think about the legislation and think about how we can advocate for change to make it easier for women to come back. It's all about that leaking leadership pipeline. They go off to have their children. How do they get back in? How do they get back in at the same level? How do they get back in and still have credibility? When they have to rush out the door at 4 o'clock because they need to get home, or they get the phone call at 11 o'clock in the morning and their child has fallen over at school and they have to go and pick them up. All of those things, actually see them get a black mark sometimes against them. Not necessarily openly, but people think, never here,
Can't
that's,
count on them.
yeah, exactly. And that's the unconscious bias, and that's what we need to really change.
Yeah, it makes me think about, how are we working with our young women and around their relationships and how they're developing their relationships for the first time. Is it always their responsibility, if they're in a female-male relationship, to always take the lead on the kids going, if they're sick at school and they're the ones having to pick up? Where is the responsibility of the other partner in the relationship of that child? What are we doing in that space to help young women have equal partnership?
A single parent, which is gender neutral. How do we as societies, again, make sure that... And as somebody who is a manager and an employer, I understand the quandary that a lot of businesses are put in, because they have things they need to get done and they need people there to do them. So I appreciate, if this were simple, we would have already solved the problem.
That's right.
We have one question online. It's from Brett Childs from Wellington, New Zealand. He asks, how can New Zealand and the US influence Pacific countries to embrace the concept of women in Parliament?
That's a very good one, and it's one that Secretary Clinton addressed fairly directly when she was attending the Pacific Islands Forum. And I think one of the best ways to do it is through encouraging these mentor networks. You know, there are some really fabulous women in the Pacific Islands who are very active in business, very active in their church, very active in their communities. They need to think of themselves as, we need to translate this into direct political representation. And then we need to have the leadership, you know, when John Key goes to the PIF, when Secretary Kerry meets with Pacific leaders at the UN General Assembly, they need to raise these issues of diversity in your political representation will make your political institutions stronger. Not that it makes it less complicated, but they will at the end of the day be stronger.
All right, well, we're pretty close to 1 o'clock, so I'd like to thank you all, and both audience members, remote viewers, and our panelists. Well, I wish I could say that we'd solved everything, but for those of us who remember a few decades ago, I think a lot of progress has been made, and sometimes that gets lost in the conversation, but there is still quite a lot that's still to be done. So I hope when we all come back in 10 years, the conversation will have moved on from careers for women instead of non-traditional careers. We won't need to talk about quotas. And we'll have a female president in the United States. So, in that order. So thank you very much, and I think that concludes our discussion today.